The morning Bass Reeves was sworn in as a deputy U.S. Marshal in 1875. Judge Isaac Parker handed him a stack of arrest warrants and watched carefully to see what the new deputy would do. Bass took the papers, looked at them for a long moment, then folded them carefully and placed them in his vest pocket. He didn't read them, couldn't read them, and Parker knew it immediately. Bass Reeves had been born into slavery in 1838, at a time when teaching enslaved people to read was illegal in most southern states. It was a crime punishable by whipping or worse. Slave owners understood that literacy was power, was freedom, was the first step toward rebellion. So they kept their human property illiterate by force of law and violence. Bass grew up in that world, working fields and carrying water and serving his master's family, never once being allowed near a book or a school. When he escaped to freedom during the Civil War and lived among the Creek and Cherokee tribes in Indian Territory, he learned their languages by ear, learned to track and hunt and survive. But nobody taught him to read English. Nobody taught him to write. By the time he became a marshal at age 37, Bass Reeves was fluent in 5 languages: English, Creek, Cherokee, Seminole, and Choctaw. He could negotiate with tribal leaders, interrogate witnesses, sweet-talk information out of saloon owners. He could shoot a man at 500 yards and track a fugitive across 100 miles of wilderness. But he couldn't read his own name if you wrote it on a piece of paper. Most men would have seen this as a fatal weakness. How could you serve arrest warrants if you couldn't read them? How could you know which outlaw you were hunting? How could you verify the charges or the rewards or the jurisdictional details that separated a legal arrest from kidnapping? Judge Parker watched Bass carefully that first day, waiting to see if this limitation would disqualify an otherwise perfect candidate for the job. What he saw instead was genius. Bass didn't try to hide his illiteracy or make excuses for it. He simply developed a system that turned his weakness into something else entirely. A kind of superhuman memory that would become legendary across Indian Territory. Here's how it worked. When Bass received new warrants, he would take them to someone he trusted, usually a court clerk or another deputy who could read. That person would read each warrant out loud while Bass listened with absolute concentration. They'd read the name of the fugitive, the charges, the physical description, the last known location, the amount of the reward, any aliases the outlaw might be using, and Bass would memorize it all. Not just memorize, he would absorb it, internalize it, make it part of his mental database of criminals and crimes. He developed tricks to help him remember. He'd associate each outlaw's name with something distinctive about their case. Jim Webb became the preacher killer in his mind. Bob Dozier was the one-eyed cattle thief. The Warner brothers were the twins who shot the Creek policeman. He'd visualize their faces based on the descriptions, imagine their voices, picture the places they might hide. When Bass rode out from Fort Smith with a stack of warrants in his saddlebag, he carried an entire rogues gallery in his head. He knew which warrant was which by the order they'd been read to him. He knew the priority of each arrest based on the severity of the crimes. And he never, not once in 32 years, arrested the wrong person. But the genius of Bass's system went deeper than just memory. His illiteracy actually gave him an advantage that literate marshals didn't have. When you can't read, you learn to read people instead. You learn to watch faces, to catch the tiny tells that indicate deception. You learn to listen to voice patterns, to hear the tremor of fear or the false bravado of a lie. You learn to trust your instincts about human nature in a way that people who rely on written reports never develop. Bass could walk into a saloon and identify an outlaw he'd never seen before just by watching how the man held himself. How he reacted when a stranger walked through the door. Whether his eyes went to the exits or to his gun. He could tell if someone was lying about their name or their business or where they'd been the previous Tuesday. And he could do it without ever asking to see their papers or checking their story against written records. There's a famous story about Bass arresting a man named Tom Story, a horse thief who'd been on the run for months. Story was hiding out in a small creek town, passing himself off as a cattle buyer from Texas. He had forged papers identifying him as Samuel Thompson, a legitimate businessman. Any marshal who could read would have looked at those papers and possibly been fooled. Bass couldn't read the papers, so he ignored them completely. Instead, he watched how Story's horse reacted to him. The animal was nervous, not properly bonded to its rider the way a rancher's horse would be. He noticed that Story's hands were soft, not calloused from ranch work. He caught the way Story's eyes flickered toward the door every time someone walked past outside. "You're Tom Story," Bass said flatly, "and you're under arrest for horse theft." Story tried to bluff, showed Bass the forged papers. "You got the wrong man, Marshal. My name's Thompson. Says so right here in black and white." Bass didn't even glance at the papers. "I don't care what it says. I know who you are. Now you can come peaceful or you can come hard, but you're coming either way." Story went peacefully. Later, in Fort Smith, he asked Bass how he'd known. "Your papers were perfect. I paid good money for those forgeries. How did you see through them?" Bass smiled. "I didn't see through them. I saw through you. Papers can lie. People can't. Not if you know how to look." This became Bass's trademark. While other marshals relied on wanted posters and written descriptions, Bass relied on his ability to read guilt and fear and deception in a man's face. While they checked names against lists, he checked behavior against his internal understanding of how criminals thought and moved. His illiteracy forced him to develop skills that made him better at his job than marshals who could read and write perfectly. But the system had its challenges. Bass had to be absolutely certain of his memory before making an arrest. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself or mix up the details of two different warrants. So he developed elaborate mental filing systems, associating each case with specific sensory details. The warrant for the murderer in the Seminole Nation smelled like leather because he'd been holding his saddle when it was read to him. The warrant for the Creek bootlegger tasted like coffee because he'd been drinking some when he heard the details. These sense memory associations helped him keep dozens of warrants straight, even when he was weeks into a trip through the territory, tired and dusty and carrying 16 prisoners chained together in his wagon. Other deputies marveled at it. They'd see Bass check his stack of warrants, running his fingers over the papers like he was reading them, then ride straight to a specific cabin 40 miles away and arrest exactly the right person for exactly the right crime. They'd watch him sort through prisoners, matching each one to their specific charges without ever consulting the written documents. It seemed almost supernatural. Some outlaws thought Bass had magical powers, that he could see into men's souls, or that God whispered the names of the guilty directly into his ear. The truth was simpler and more impressive. Bass Reeves had turned a limitation that would have ended most law enforcement careers into a superpower through sheer force of will and intelligence. He'd found a way to not just work around his inability to read, but to use it as an advantage. There were close calls, of course, times when Bass's memory was tested to its limits. Once, he carried warrants for 3 different men named John Smith, a common problem in the territory where many fugitives used aliases. Bass kept them straight by remembering that one was tall and missing 2 fingers, one had a scar across his left cheek, and one walked with a limp from an old bullet wound. When he finally caught all 3 men months apart, each warrant matched perfectly to the right John Smith. Another time, Bass was carrying so many warrants that even his phenomenal memory strained under the load. 17 different fugitives, some for similar crimes in adjacent territories. He solved the problem by creating a physical system to supplement his mental one. He arranged the warrants in his saddlebag in a specific order, grouped by region. When he caught a prisoner, He'd pull the warrant from the correct section of the bag and have someone read it to verify the details matched what he remembered. He never once pulled the wrong warrant. Judge Parker came to trust Bass's system completely. In 32 years, Bass never had a single arrest overturned because he'd served the wrong warrant or arrested the wrong person. His accuracy rate was perfect, literally 100%. Marshals who could read and write couldn't match that record. Some of them arrested the wrong John Smith or confused similar cases or served outdated warrants. But not Bass Reeves. His memory was infallible. But there was a cost to this system that nobody talked about. Every night in the field, Bass had to review the warrants in his mind, going through each name and charge and description to make sure nothing slipped away. He lived in constant fear that he'd forget something crucial. That age or exhaustion would finally betray his memory and cause him to make a mistake. As he got older, this fear grew. By his 60s, Bass worried that his mental filing system might start to fail. He began writing down names, not full warrants, just the names of fugitives in large, careful letters that took him hours to form. He couldn't read them back to himself, but he could show them to others who could verify his memory. It was a safety net, insurance against the possibility that his mind might finally let him down. It never did. Even at 69 years old, when Bass was working as a city policeman in Muskogee after Oklahoma became a state, his memory remained sharp as a knife. He could recall the details of arrests from 30 years earlier, could describe fugitives he'd caught in the 1870s with perfect accuracy. The mental discipline he'd developed to compensate for his illiteracy had kept his mind strong, even as his body began to fail. In 1910, when Bass Reeves died of kidney disease at age 71, the newspapers wrote about his incredible career, the 3,000 arrests, the dangerous gunfights, the clever disguises. But very few mentioned that he'd accomplished all of it without being able to read a single word. It wasn't that people didn't know. It was common knowledge in Fort Smith and Muskogee. It was just that by the end, it seemed so irrelevant to his accomplishments that it barely merited mention. Bass Reeves had proven that literacy wasn't a requirement for greatness, that intelligence came in many forms, and that sometimes the obstacles we face can be transformed into advantages if we're creative and determined enough. He'd turned what should have been a career-ending limitation into a legendary strength. And in doing so, he'd taught everyone who knew him an important lesson. Don't judge a man by what he can't do. Judge him by what he does with what he has. Bass Reeves couldn't read, but he could read people better than anyone alive. He could read tracks in dust, could read guilt in a nervous glance, could read danger in the way a man's hand drifted toward his gun. And when you're a lawman in Indian Territory in the 1880s, those were the kinds of reading that actually mattered. The arrest warrants in Bass's saddlebag were just paper. The real warrant was written in his memory, in his understanding of human nature, in his unshakable commitment to bringing criminals to justice. And that's a kind of literacy that no school could teach.